JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 4 I have completed and I loved it. As I was writing up notes for this part review, I really struggled to narrow down everything that I wanted to talk about because the town, while part 3 was very episodic and there was an overarching plot, but that wasn't the main focus of the story for large chunks of the story, part 4 felt very much the same, where it was episodic, we're introduced to new stands, we're exploring this town a little bit more, and it felt really similar, just a much smaller scale. But by the end of the arc, I'm looking back and I'm realizing how tangled everything ended up being and how important things that seemed like a side tangent, like a fun side tangent, which I was fine with. I was fine with that's what this show is, actually became really important, really essential to the core story that part 4 was telling, to the point that I'm just like, man, I kind of just want to rewatch the whole thing and then write up a review. I didn't do that. But I'm going through thinking about each episode and each stand and each element and having a hard time making it concise, talking about how tangled this town is and how wide this town felt, when at the beginning it seemed like we were exploring a cozy small town, but it actually felt very expansive by the end while still having that cozy small town feel. It was really impressive. It was a lot more than I expected from JoJo's as far as how cohesive it ended up being. And I don't say that as a knock against JoJo's. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure has become one of my all-time favorite anime and manga, but I haven't read the manga. But category, it's become one of my all-time favorite shows. But I expected it to be a kind of chaos, which I love for this show, but it ended up being a deceptive chaos that had a ton of intention that I didn't even recognize until I got to the end. But right from the start, we are introduced to this lovely radio music and this small town serving up breakfast, but then a sinister, okay, what's going on? And then we move right along to just exploring the town, being introduced to Josuke, to how he is connected to the Jojo family, reintroducing Jotaro and then eventually Joseph and how the role that they're going to play into this small town, and building up our cast, but also expanding the town each episode as well, getting introduced to new characters, new elements of the town, and of course, new stands. Nearly every minor character introduced is some sort of antagonist. They seem almost villainous, or at the very least, very morally questionable. And we interact with them, oftentimes defeat them, and then they don't just go away. It's not just a one and done sort of interaction. They become a part of the town. Whether they become a part of the town by being a rock that's just a nice little feature that the town appreciates, or they become a background character, even to the point of an alien that's introduced to this town and becomes a background character. His story isn't wider. His story isn't this big elaborate play. He's a background character, or they become introduced to the core part of the group. But the town feels so living and breathing because we're introduced to a character and then they continue to be a part of the story. They aren't just addressed and then we move on. But also, as we're introduced to all these new characters and as we continue to expand on the town, we also expand a lot on what stands are capable of being. We really push the boundaries of the capabilities of stands and how interesting their abilities can be. Like the Italian restaurant owner who seemed so nefarious, but as we continue to eat his food and watch Okayatsu be compelled to continue eating and seemingly being tortured and then drawn back in, and it turns out that it was just part of the process of healing his body and helping him become better, more able-bodied. And it seemed so sinister, and we're accustomed to stand users being inherently so sinister unless they're the main character. But in this case, it's just showing someone in the town that's just living, that's just trying to serve good food and help people. And the way that all kind of built up only to totally shift our expectations, totally shift our perspective, and realize, no, he just wants a clean kitchen. No, he just wants to help people. He just wants to serve this delicious food, and he has a stand, so it's a part of it. Or we see a stand that is being used in a very invasive and even nefarious way, like reading a person's inner self for self-gain to write your story, and then writing on them, which hinders their free will. But this character ends up being a core part of our group, and even bonds with Koichi just because he decided to. We have a character that's introduced as, at best, I can call him just an annoying punk, and he ends up having one of the most compelling conclusions to his personal arc in the entire part. And this also ties into initially exploring the abilities our main villain has. We have episodes that seem meaningless but end up deepening the characters. Like when Josuke has first contact with an extraterrestrial life, and the lad uses this chance to scam his friend. And then the episode ends on an abrupt fire that's been raging behind them and no one noticed. But just an episode later, those two who constantly bicker and get on each other's nerves are risking their lives for one another, while bickering and getting on each other's nerves. We're introduced to a character that's obsessive to the point of abuse, confining our sweet Koichi to a home and forcing him to eat horrible foods, subjecting him to terrible things, to include nearly an electric chair. And not only does he become his legitimate girlfriend, somehow, but also that obsession leads the story to introducing us to the Cinderella stand user, who ultimately plays a huge part in how Kira hides his identity when he takes on a new face. And of course, my beloved ghost girl, who seemed like just a really great spooky story built just for me and the things that I love. But she ended up being the introduction to Kira, and everything came back around to her in the end in the most satisfying way. Honestly, I could give a dozen examples of how this story seemed to be episodic and seemed to be just like this random sequence of events, but things ended up coming back around or getting tangled together in a way that made the story, in retrospect, seem so intentional, and I'm sure on rewatch it must be that much more. I also just really enjoyed the characters in this one. While I have a particular soft spot for the Stardust Crusaders and their dynamics, I just love them so much. I really liked how different the dynamics were in this group. We have such an unlikely grouping. We have Josuke, who is just trying to live his small town life, content being raised by a single mother and not having a lot of family outside of that, content being able to just heal people and creatures as he comes across them and not really looking to be involved in this wider scale thing. We have Koichi, who is such a soft sweetheart who starts off very timid and shy, but grows to be so brave and strong, and I love that his stand reflects that. His stand, it appears pretty useless at first, but it continues to evolve into something that is still small and understated, but in its own way has great strengths and is incredibly useful, just not in such an obvious way. Okoyatsu, who is such a dope and has the strongest stand ever, but just doesn't really logic so well, but who also has a heart of gold and cares so deeply for his family and for his friends. He's such a loyal guy, and he's really hard not to love. We have a rich, secluded mangaka who just says whatever he wants and and never really stops being kind of a self-centered brat. And the way their stories work together is with a lot of bickering and frustration, but also loyalty. I don't know that Rohan outwardly likes anyone but Koichi, but they would all do anything for each other, and there's something especially charming about that. And I found it really interesting that Josuke, while he is the Jojo of this part, he doesn't really feel like the main character of Morioh. There are stretches of time where we're not focused on him at all, and plenty of other people take the spotlight. He kind of feels as much like a side main character as any of the other side main characters. But the fact that this isn't this large-scale, epic, worldwide travel with these huge high stakes, but instead it's a more slice-of-life, cozy town, and Josuke is just a part of the town, but we happen to be following his story along with other characters. There's something actually really charming about that to me. However, my one complaint about the characters and how much time they get and everything is in that we brought back Jotaro and Joseph. And while I loved the role that Jotaro played in the dynamic of Josuke learning to trust Jotaro and accepting that he does have other family and that he does have to work with them, but also Jotaro kind of being a mentor and the wiser person in this group, the one that would come in and help them when they weren't strong enough yet and battle with them and near die for them. I really loved the role that he played. I found the role that Joseph played to be pretty disappointing just because he was barely there. I loved the dynamic of Josuke really just not wanting to bond with his estranged father and feeling that blockade there and kind of being forced to soften towards him, and then the conclusion of him stealing his wallet at the end, which is just so very Joseph. Like, it was the most like father like son conclusion possible. And I like that there still is, it's not like we're a big wholesome family now. It's still complicated. But I also just think that if Joseph were completely removed from this arc, it wouldn't have changed that much. So I kind of found his role disappointing. And I'm not gonna lie, finding out that he cheated on Suzy Q while he was off trying to save Holly's life did hinder my affection for his character. But like I said, I really didn't mind that Josuke didn't always feel like the main character of part 4. I actually liked it for this particular setting. I wouldn't want it for every JoJo part going forward necessarily, but for the small town feel and for how this small town felt like every character had their own story and their own role and they were active and moving in and out of it, having Josuke feel the same way really worked for me. And I also really liked that for a villain as interesting as Kira, he was just as much the main character as Josuke was. In fact, I think Kira was the best part of this part. Kira was such an interesting villain. He wasn't interested in a large-scale domination or hunting down the main characters. He wasn't maniacal or bombastic until the very end. He would never fly from the sky to crush you with a cement truck, which is a knock against his character, actually. I'm kidding. A little bit. Kira is a refreshing difference in the villains in that he just wants to live a very quiet life and doesn't really want to be noticed by anyone. The things that make him compelling as a villain is how grounded and real he feels. He's creepy and disturbing. He has these irresistible urges, but he has to be strategic in when he gives into them so as not to be caught and not to have a spotlight put on him. His first date that we saw with one of his hands was the most disturbing thing I've seen. Watching him shop with the hand and touch different foods and then purchase not the one that he destroyed with the severed hand, continuing to go on a date with it and eat from the hand. And like, it was all the most disgusting thing I've ever seen in JoJo's, and JoJo's leans into disgusting a lot, but that had to do it for me because it was just so grounded in what a serial killer might be like what their mind might be and what they might do when we're behind the scenes. And then realizing that the hand was starting to rot, so he had to break up with it and go find a new hand to date. Like, that was so grotesque. But also, he needed to not be found out. He needed to go under the radar. He needed his crimes to be subtle and quiet, which led him to be put in very JoJo-esque situations. He continued, while having that grounded villain writing, he still was a JoJo character. He still had to go into these ridiculous scenarios to try to get the hand back. He still wanted to be stealthy, but wasn't so good at being stealthy, and that was used for the humor of it. He still made the most ridiculous mistakes because it's JoJo's and everything has to be dumb. And I say that in the most affectionate way possible. I loved that we had multiple episodes from his perspective, seeing the way his day-to-day life worked while he was still flying under the radar, and then seeing him become more and more sloppy as he started to panic because his normal quiet life was in jeopardy, and then seeing him turn true villain when he was forced to actually become one that had to confront the people that were hunting him down. And we saw how sadistic he could be, especially with Hayato, the son of the person that he took over the life of, which it was so interesting to see him take over this life, to see him take over this new body, enter this already established family dynamic, and see how he changed it first with his new wife, who fell in love for the very first time when he started displaying petty theft. But also his son, who, when introduced, is just this punk kid who has video cameras all over the house and who has no interest in interacting with his parents at all. Who would have thought that he would actually be the MVP of the entire conclusion, that he would be such a brave kid, such a resilient kid who fought and fought and fought despite being put in such a terrible situation. But seeing Kira interact with these families and trying to blend in and trying to understand what role he needed to take, but also turn into this vindictive, sadistic guy who loved tormenting this child when Bites the Dust was evolved, came into the story, and he just watched this kid be stuck in this cycle over and over again. And as our core people are dying over and over again because of Bites the Dust, and Kira is telling him, you killed them. This is on you. He's gaslighting the kid. He's laughing and taunting him as he's stuck in this cycle. Kira's abilities were so cool, from being able to touch anything and turn it into a bomb, choose when it activates, and how threatening that alone was. But then as it evolved into this tank that is heat sensitive and hunts them down, and then turns into this time warp that if anyone hears about who Kira is, if his identity is revealed, which ties perfectly into what Kira's goals were as a small town serial killer, if they find out his identity, then they die, they're killed, and Hayato, I don't even know if I'm saying his name right, is sucked back in time and forced to relive it all again, but fate has been decided, and so it's just this cycle of pain and suffering and death. Oh, it was just so good. But then also the fight, the final 4 episodes where Kira is sending off these air bubbles, because the cat thing, of course, came back into play, which was the cat plant thing came back into play, which I loved as well, as he's sending off these destructive bubbles and chasing down Josuke with it. We see how he can turn into a stalker. You know, he at first just wants a quiet life and doesn't want to be discovered and isn't hunting down our main characters, but when his quiet life is threatened, he will turn stalker. And the creative ways that he works alongside the cat plant to hunt them down, and then the creative ways that Josuke comes up with combating that with blood and with trickery. These two, who were both happy with their small town quiet life and were forced to confront having to play a larger role in the story of Morioh. And for Josuke, his abilities are wrapped around healing and in putting things back together, whereas Kira, his abilities were all around destruction, around tearing things apart. We had a lot of great fights in this season. Easily my 2 favorites. The first is between Kira, Koichi, and Jotaro, how they had to think through this new scenario that they were thrown into, how Jotaro realized that it was heat sensitive, and Koichi figured out how to stand up on his own against this stand, figure out how to move the heat seeking in other directions, and fought and fought and fought. They both took on so much damage in this. I actually thought I actually thought Jotaro died in this scene for a minute there, and I was so mad because I was streaming this one with Jay, which, by the way, over on Jay's Twitch, JD Legend, I'll link his Twitch in the description, he would pick out the best episodes, the most exciting episodes of this season, and we would stream it together over on his Twitch. And I was so mad at him because I thought that he brought me onto his Twitch just to make me watch my favorite Jojo die. but I didn't. And watching Koichi fight and push and near die, take such a strong beating while Josuke was bleeding out over in the corner. But they were so resilient and they pushed so hard. And Josuke standing up and fighting despite being on the brink of death and both of them collapsing at the end. It was such a great fight. Plus, I also loved the little touch in that fight of seeing how Kira's obsessiveness and need to control situations, need to have things exactly right. I loved how that was displayed in that fight with him trying to kill Koichi, but then pausing to fix his socks first because he just couldn't stand it, and then he went on to finish the kill. Like, that was such a nice touch. But then also the conclusion, the final 4 episodes of the season were brilliant. I already described a bunch of it, but also everything that happened with Okayatsu of him being killed. Like, he actually died, which meant that Josuke could not heal him, but Josuke couldn't accept it. Carrying him out, screaming at him to wake up, trying over and over again to heal him. Hayato needing him to move on and needing him to accept the death so that they could try to save themselves. But it was very hard to tell him, listen, your friend's dead. You have to move forward. But that grieving, oh my goodness, JoJo's does it in every single season. And it's so good. The way comrades, even reluctant comrades, the way they respond in the face of each other's death, the way they grieve is just so compelling. And we had to watch Josuke refuse to accept his friend's death. But then when Josuke is facing Kira and it doesn't look like it's going to go well for him, I mean, he's also been beat terribly. He has rods sticking out of his body. It's not going well. Okayatsu shows up with his completely overpowered stand. And in his Okayatsu way of saying, I don't really know how this works, but I'm just gonna go ahead and use my stand the only way I understand it, defends Josuke. And I just love that the response to this was Josuke yelling at him, berating him. You should have just opened your eyes if you were alive. And they're insulting each other back and forth and crying and so happy to see each other, so happy to be reunited. It was perfect for the dynamics of this group, for these kids who are in this situation and who are constantly bickering and fighting, but are so loyal to one another. That reaction to him coming back from the dead, not walking into the light, I thought was one of the best displays of their dynamics, and it was one of my favorite scenes. This part does have an extraordinary number of conveniences. Kira's dad in and of himself, I think, is one, but also, even though I did really like his dad and the role he played, it was pretty funny. Like this a guy who's like, I mean, you know, you have this compulsion, you want to kill women, I'm gonna support your dreams, I want what's best for you, I'll defend you no matter what. Like, we love a supportive pops. But there's that, but then also how Killer Queen just randomly had an entire opening in his torso just to conveniently fit the cat plant in there because, like, why not? Sure. Or the fact that we had, it was Josuke, Rohan, and Koichi were, like, just around the corner, and there's screaming happening, there's explosions, which apparently were silent, I didn't pick that up. All this chaos is going on just over there, and they just, like, can't hear it because the rain's a little loud. JoJo's always has some ridiculous conveniences in it, so I don't really care that there were a lot of conveniences in this one, but for some reason, they seemed a little bit more egregious, and I think it's just because the small town setting and Kira as a villain all feels so much more grounded that the ridiculous conveniences feel somehow like they fit just a little bit less. It's still JoJo's, so I'm not hung up on it. I just thought I would mention. But after the conclusion, after the finale of part 3, I was expecting something crazy for part 4. And the ending that I got was so fitting for part 4 in that it wasn't this amazing Zaworldo kind of fight. Instead, it was still there was still so much happening, and it was crazy and it was exciting, but also the conclusion for Kira was poetic. This man who sought normalcy, who sought to not be seen, to not be noticed, to just live this quiet life of, you know, killing, died in a very normal way, just being hit by an ambulance and then run over. His face was run over, his face was ripped off so that even his appearance in death was nondescript. But also, he just wanted this peaceful life. He just wanted to be left alone. But instead, when he thought he was having this great victory, when he thought he was getting away and setting back time, in fact, he was killed and brought back to the ghost girl who introduced us to the conflict of Kira. Now she gets to face him in the end. She gets to be the one that confronts him one last time, that gets her closure, and watches him be dragged to a place where he will, in fact, not rest in peace. Also, just the man who's obsessed with hands and who kills to have this sickening relationship with the hands of the women that he murdered is being dragged into hell by hands, and by ugly, distorted ones, not even pretty ones. Everything just came together in that final sequence with Kira in the most satisfying way, where it was amazing, and so much chaos and craziness happened in the end, but the ending was so subtle and a kind of poetic justice that was just so satisfying. I'm not gonna lie, even though I absolutely loved part 4, I still loved part 3 a little bit more. It's in the over-the-top chaos. It's in the unhinged, expansive ridiculousness that I thrive. So even though part 3 had much lower lows than part 4 did, it also, for me and my chaos-loving heart, had higher highs. Whereas Morioh was more of a consistent, slow build that culminated into something really fantastic. But I'm gonna love the more bombastic thing just by nature. But those are my thoughts on part 4. Sorry if I didn't seem as energetic for this part. I loved it. Let me assure you, I'm just fighting a cold and my brain is foggy. But I will be starting part 5 right away. As always, my Patreon is linked in the description if you want to talk with me about it episode by episode. I always watch an episode and then hang out and chat with people in the Discord. Or if you're not interested in Patreon, Jay's Twitch is linked in the description. He is going to pick out episodes for us to watch together for part 5 as well. So go give him a follow and just watch all of his stuff because he's amazing. Please do let me know what you thought of part 4. How do you rank the 4 parts that I've watched so far? How do you rank them in order of your enjoyment? Honestly, it's really difficult for me to rank them. I know part 3 is my favorite, but beyond that, it's really difficult for me to rank them because I have loved every part. Like, there has not been a dud for me. And I love them almost all on the same level, just for different reasons. Because they are all really, really different. But I've loved them all. Like, they're all 10 out of 10s pretty much. Not that doesn't mean that they're not flawed, because I could poke holes and complain about elements of each of them. I just love them a lot. But please do let me know your thoughts. I would love to chat with you more in the comments. I'll see you again soon. Bye.